For those of you whom are watching that are veteran leftists and fairly well read, nothing that I'm about to discuss today is probably anything new to you. But the intent of this series is to educate those who have yet to have been disillusioned to the spectacle of liberal democracy as a means of bringing about social change. If you know anybody like this, please forward them this video. This is meant for them. In my previous video on the subject, I referenced a phenomenon in the capitalist system discovered by Karl Marx known as the propensity for the rate of profit to fall, or the falling rate of profit. Pay close attention, because when you understand this peculiarity, as well as a handful of others, you will begin to understand why the Keynesian economic approach works, as well as the neoclassical approach. That's right, two diametrically opposed ends on a pole are completely viable ways of organizing the capitalist system. When the rate of profit is high, high taxes, regulations, and a strong social safety net can be afforded. Conversely, when the rate of profit is low, tax cuts, deregulation, and austerity also function. When either are applied given the right material circumstances, positive results can be yielded. Negative results can also be yielded. And in this episode, I will explain why the Keynesian approach and a Green New Deal is contingent upon a number of circumstances that no longer exist and would require us to emulate the conditions prior to World War II. The falling rate of profit is a phenomenon where, relative to the investment that the capital has made into their capital, over time they received reduced returns relative to what they put in. The reason that this happens is because the drive of the competitive mechanism. Capitalists are incentivized to invest into more advanced means of production. So they produce more goods cheaper and undercut their competitors on the market. The capitalist then gains a differential advantage, and unless his competitors can adapt their output to match his, they will go out of business. So over time, they all invest into the same advanced means of production, allowing them to produce goods as cost-effectively and as cheaply as the first capitalist can, and as a result, nobody holds differential advantage anymore. And the cost of the commodity in question has now become cheaper. Rinse and repeat this cycle, and what begins to happen as a result is that since there is a decline in the value of the good produced, there becomes a general decline in the rate of profit. And to restore the rate of profit, capitalists are incentivized to either increase the rate of exploitation or further advance the means of production to once again gain competitive advantage. The crisis comes when the market becomes oversaturated with cheap commodities. That is, more goods are produced than what the market can absorb, and as a result, capitalists cannot realize their return on investment, and in response, they shut down their factories, fire their workers, and sit on their capital until new investment opportunities emerge. And as more capital is accumulated, the more wealth is created, there becomes less and less wealth and capital to accumulate as it becomes further and further centralized into the hands of a minority of firms. You see, as the general rule in capitalism, the winner eats the losers, as those who go out of business are forced to sell off their capital cheap much of the time. And every time there is a rotation of the boom-bust cycle, the number of competitive firms on the market shrinks, and the formation of trusts, monopolies, and cartels is inevitable. This is the reason why a slew of legislation passed through Congress in the form of antitrust laws to break up the major monopolies and cartels during the late 1800s and early 1900s. From the Sharman Act of 1890, the Clayton Act of 1914, and the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. But even in the face of these laws, the trend in capitalism is towards the centralization of wealth and power, and with all these mechanisms in place, decades later, many of the laws that were once passed have since been subverted or altered as to allow for the reformation of big business. Just look at the Standard Oil. In 1911, the company was broken up into dozens of smaller competitors. Where are those companies today? Well, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York went on to become ExxonMobil and then merged into ExxonMobil in 1999. Standard Oil California would become Chevron and acquisition Standard Oil of Kentucky in 1960, and then would go on to merge with yet another firm to become Chevron Texaco. Standard Oil of Ohio and Standard Oil of Indiana would go on to merge together and become British Petroleum, and the Ohio Oil Company would go on to become Marathon Oil. Mergers and acquisitions go on all the time in this system. All one has to do is look at the shrinking number of larger and larger firms to see this in action. From the fact that most of the global food and water supply is owned and controlled by 10 companies on Earth, to the fact that 90% of our media is controlled by only 6 companies. And contrary to what the capitalist apologist will tell you, their job isn't to meet human needs or satisfy desires so much as it is to maximize profit. It's this reason why, in spite of the fact that we produce enough food to feed 10 billion people, billions go hungry every night. It's the reason why clean renewable energy currently isn't in full global use. They seek to extract from you and exploit you in every way possible as to maximize the amounts that they can get out of you. And just like the boom-bust cycle or the falling rate of profit, or the consolidation of wealth and power, this is not a glitch, it is a feature. And as I shall explain in a moment, social democracy is certainly not the answer. Let's talk a bit about the history of Keynesian economics, at least in its application here in America. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression began. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, and millions more were living in shanty towns. Herbert Hoover was president at the time, and after solid years of doing fuck all to alleviate the immiseration of the American people, he was forced to step down in 1933. Cue Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR introduced a series of laws and reforms in his New Deal policies to reinvigorate the economy, expand the role of the government in the economy, as well as provide entitlements and increasing workers' rights. And to a limited extent, it did work. Unemployment was cut in half. Wealth taxes were introduced on the top 1%, and the economy was slowly beginning to pick back up again. While it is true that Keynesian economics most certainly alleviated the Depression and facilitated the recovery of the US economy, there is another side to the story that progressives generally don't account for. And that is the fact that FDR's administration also introduced a number of pro-business reforms to encourage investments. How is it that they were able to afford a New Deal when the rate of profit was crashing? Well, the first factor was the aforementioned legislation. In order to finance these social programs and infrastructure projects, it requires tax revenue, and to secure that revenue, firms need an incentive to invest and generate value. And the way that they did that was alleviating the risk. One of the ways that they did this was with the establishment of institutions tasked with redirecting capital into socially desirable ventures. One such institution was the Federal Housing Administration. Their job was to get banks investing into the housing market again, and this was accomplished by setting up a state-managed insurance pool by offering an amount in principal back to the banks equal to the mortgage, in case the borrower defaults. The FHA offered risk-free loans and provided an incentive to lend private capital. Next was the creation of the Rural Electrification Administration, which was tasked with providing power companies incentives to invest into electrifying the countryside. For a long time, many of them did not want to do this because of the perceived cost of electrification, and they didn't want the government to step in because that would be perceived as communism. So to reduce the cost of electrification, the formation of rural cooperatives was incentivized and encouraged by the REA, offering co-ops startup low-interest 20-year loans to take up the task. In summary, the New Deal had to offer incentives to firms to invest into the economy by reducing the risk and assuring that they could get returns on their investments. So while the economy had made a partial recovery, at least by the late 1930s, thanks to the New Deal, what actually got the US out of the Depression was World War II. In 1940, the Defense Plant Corporation was formed, which mobilized and directed American companies into the construction of planes, tanks, bombs, guns, bullets, soldier uniforms, and other goods necessary for the war effort. Periodic wars are a good thing under capitalism because they organize the productive forces, circumvent depression, put people to work, and afterwards, assuming that your side wins, firms can go into the territory of the losers and buy up all of their resources and assets cheap. And seeing as that America was thousands of miles away from the action, seeing as that our country didn't get bombed to smithereens, our nation was left relatively unscathed from the war. And with most of the planet in ruin, along with the perceived threat of communism, all these variables played a role in the relative prosperity enjoyed by the United States during the post-war boom. When capital is destroyed, that is, buildings, farms, and factories and land, it opens up opportunities for reinvestment and redevelopment and infrastructure projects. As I've stated before, in capitalism, the winner eats the losers. And this is what happened in much of Europe after the war. Thousands of cities and villages were reduced to rubble, and this created a great deal of room for capital to re-expand and bloom again. Not to mention the excuse for the US military-industrial complex to blossom, as the fabricated threat of the big evil Russians was just around the corner. Why do we have to go to Korea? To stop the spread of communism. Why do we have to go to Vietnam? To stop the spread of communism. So within this context, with the fresh destruction of capital around the world, with the fact that socialist countries offered a real material alternative to the capitalist way of life, along with the restored rate of profit, social democracy was much more tolerated and feasible. The capitalist countries were in a position where not only could they afford to make these concessions, they really didn't have a choice. However, look what happened afterwards. Reactionaries took power and proceeded to introduce a long line of tax cuts, budget cuts, and deregulations, slowly but surely unraveling and dismantling all those hard-earned gains. And trust me, the reforms brought by the FDR administration didn't come peacefully. There was massive civil unrest, rioting, and labor organizing going on at the time. So historically, social democracy has been a tool used by the elites to placate the masses and undermine the potential for a proletarian revolution. And at the same time, unions were dismantled and the labor movement was destroyed. There was a solid 50-year period in this country where you could go to jail, or be deported, or lose your job, or even be outright killed for being an open socialist. The right wing in this country has succeeded in undoing virtually all the material gains won for the working class in the last several decades. Why did Reaganomics, supply-side economics, and neoliberal school of thought prevail? Well, just like Keynesian economics, neoliberalism was used to preserve capitalism. And as it turns out, when you cut taxes for corporations, lax regulations, privatize the commons, and outsource your jobs to countries abroad where you can pay people pennies on the dollar, it tends to restore the rate of profits. As of right now, since the fall of the Soviet Union, global capitalism has reigned supreme for decades, and all the problems that we face here in America today are because the interests of the American working class contradict the interests of the global capitalist elite. Flint doesn't have clean water because there is no money in cleaning it up. Millions go homeless every year because there's no money in solving the homelessness crisis. Thousands die of preventable diseases in America every year because there's no money in giving them health care. Our infrastructure rots because it's not profitable to reinvigorate it. Renewable energy projects go unfulfilled because they're not profitable like gas and oil are. If you go issue by issue, analyzing the problems that plague this country, none of them are profitable. And if you haven't figured it out by now, the billionaires are not people like you and me. Their concerns are so far removed from that of the general public that they may as well be vampires and reptiles. And it isn't the government that dictates capital, it's the capital that dictates the government. I think George Carlin put it best.
There's a reason. There's a reason for this. There's a reason education sucks, and it's the same reason that it will never, ever, ever be fixed. It's never going to get any better. Don't look for it. Be happy with what you got. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls.
They own and control the economy. They have very much become despots in their own right. And since social democracy working in the past is contingent upon firms' willingness to invest and collaborate with the government, they're the ones who have all the power. So you see, liberal, this isn't a question of developing public services, but of expropriating the means of production and transforming them into public services. Seeing as that they literally bought the government, I don't know what makes you think any of the politicians that you elect would ever make this possible. Once again, politicians do not own and control means of production. Capitalists do. and the politicians that do own and control means of production are capitalists. But let's be optimistic for a minute. Let's say Bernie Sanders is elected president of the United States by some miracle. Not only do you have all the Republicans opposing him, you have half the Democrats as well. They will filibuster and block anything that he tries to pass through the House, even if you got a majority Democrat House and Senate. That is still 2/3 of Congress that is actively working against him. And let's say you could even get enough Democrats on his side for his policy positions to pass. All the banks and corporations have to do is stop investing, sit on their capital, and fire all of their workers, causing the economy to come to a grinding halt. Do you really think in a situation like that, Bernie Sanders' administration is equipped to do anything about it? As history has shown, the first New Deal was contingent on the government accommodating the needs of private business, to get them investing where the government wants them to invest. And with private business as big and as powerful and as influential as it is now, for a Green New Deal to work, you're going to have no choice but to make it profitable for big business. If you want your reforms to pass, it's going to have to accommodate the needs of the capitalists and incentivize them to make it work. Which means no matter what, you're always going to end up with a shitty, compromised, watered-down version of the policies and legislation that would meaningfully tackle the problems that plague the proletariat. And anything that does get passed will simply be undone by the Republican Party next time they're elected. After all, just look at Donald Trump. The most productive policies achieved by Obama have effectively been dismantled under the Trump administration. You don't think the same thing would happen in a post-Bernie Sanders presidency? And finally, if all else fails, there's the possibility that they go mask off, coup the government, and establish a junta or a fascist dictatorship of some kind to maintain their hegemony. If that sounds like it's outside the realm of possibility, I encourage you to look up what happened to Chile after the socialist president Salvador Allende was elected. Or look up Coca-Cola death squads in South America. Or go to Google and type in Hitler's American Friends. You'd be surprised what lengths the ruling class would go to protect their wealth. So if you are a hardline capitalist, or for some reason or another you just enjoy deep-throating corporate cock, then I suppose that's your prerogative. However, if you're like me, and you really want genuine social change to come, and you look at the system around you and see how unjust and cruel it is, and it pisses you off, then maybe you should consider, just maybe, not advocating for any sort of violence here, but maybe the only solution is Red Revolution.